Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Thank you. And let me just say, we are coming up on a remarkable moment. In just a short time, the United States will mark 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document filled with bold language about liberty, equality, and human dignity. Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. You know, for 10 years now, the Not Old Better Show has celebrated health, wellness, culture, history, and the stories that remind us we're not old, we're better now. As America commemorates 250 years of independence in 2026, this special series offers a dynamic explanation of America's past, present, and future. Explore the people, ideas, conflicts, and aspirations that have shaped America and how the past informs the challenges and possibilities ahead. At 250, America is still young enough to dream and seasoned enough to know that freedom asks something of every generation. Through our Smithsonian Associates interview series, we invite you to hear that story and more stories with a fresh perspective, honest reflection, and renewed purpose. In this series, we're stepping back, not to settle history, but to explore it, to look at the places, the people, and the moments that have shaped who we are and who we're still becoming. Who we became was shaped by the Declaration of Independence. But it is so much more than parchment behind glass. It is a bold act of defiance, a political gamble, a literary achievement, and a promise that has changed every generation since 1776. On this Smithsonian Associates episode of the Not Old Better Show, we welcome Robert Watson, a returning guest, an audience favorite, a distinguished professor of American history at Lynn University, and author of his 50th book, Declaration, The Story of American Independence. And what a milestone book it is. Smithsonian Associate Robert Watson takes us back to the arguments, the edits, the fears, and high-stakes choices behind the most famous document shaping America. We often picture Thomas Jefferson alone with a quill, giving birth to a nation in one brilliant burst. But the real story is far more dramatic. A committee at work, Congress making cuts, colonies divided, British pressure mounting, and a group of men signing their names to what could easily have been treated as treason. But this conversation also reaches beyond the familiar founders. Professor Watson brings forward the women, enslaved individuals, indigenous peoples, printers, dissenters, and ordinary citizens whose lives were shaped by those famous words, "All men are created equal." As America looks ahead to its 250th anniversary, and we celebrate this with Smithsonian Associates, this episode asks what the Declaration meant in 1776, what it has meant across generations, and what promises remain unfinished. Smithsonian Associate Robert Watson will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes for more details about Professor Watson's appearance. But we have Professor Watson again today, so please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Watson to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series. I'm Paul Vogelzang. We're looking forward to this conversation, as we have with all of these American history episodes. Professor Robert Watson, welcome back to the program.
Good to be back. Love your show and real pleasure. And there's nothing better than talking about your book, unless if you're talking about your cat or your grandkids.
Good. Well, I will tell you, just as an aside, my wife and I have two boys. One of our boys married about 4 years ago, about a year ago, moved in with us with our first grandson. So we've got
Congratulations.
it all today. Yeah,
Good,
thanks
good.
so much.
Should we
That's what
all
I
be so
appreciate.
lucky to have them right there?
We should be, absolutely. Well, it's so nice to talk to you again. Absolutely. And I think the timing is perfect, especially because we are going to be talking about your new book, Declaration, The Story of American Independence. Thank you again for sharing it with me. Congratulations always on your amazing work. And I think the Declaration is it's certainly timely. We are at our American 250 celebration with Smithsonian. Our program is going to tie some of that together, but mainly talk about your upcoming presentation with Smithsonian Associates and your new book. And I want to start by asking you a question about the Declaration itself, because certainly, my generation will appreciate the fact that this is a sacred American artifact. I live just outside of the DC area, and there in the DC area, the Declaration is sealed behind glass. It's also surrounded by myth. And in your book, you really talk about it from a very human perspective. It feels a little bit messy, even at times, certainly political and full of tension. And I wonder if we can just start. What's the most surprising thing that you found when you stopped treating it as this monument and started treating it as this living argument, this living document?
Good.
Yeah.
Great start. I have great reverence for the founders, the Declaration, the Constitution, and it's hard to not be emotional about it. In fact, I tell my friends, family that I can't believe this is my job.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
get paid to go to the Smithsonian and National Archives
We
and do
love having
research
you.
and
Yeah.
write books about
Yeah.
history. It's a dream, but it is difficult. In some ways, I always tell younger historians that you kind of have to first unlearn what you think you know before you jump into a topic, because we all have myths about the Boston Massacre. And of course, it wasn't a massacre, it was a riot. We have myths about the Boston Tea Party. It didn't happen the way it's often presented. There were remarkable heroes, incomprehensibly so, at D-Day, but we have to sort of push some of the myths and movies aside to get into the meat and potatoes of it. So that was difficult for me because, I honor the founders in the Declaration, think it's one of the most enlightened documents in human history. So I kind of had to push all that off and approach it with a critical eye. Ironically, I'm now back to full circle. I think I appreciate it more now than ever. I guess the thing that really struck me is we have this idea that so many of the founders favored independence. They called it independency, is what they called it. When in fact, 74, when they first met at Carpenter's Hall, 75, 76 at the Pennsylvania State House, we called Independence Hall, almost everybody favored reconciliation. They considered themselves to be proud Englishmen. They shared a language, a culture, clothing, food, religion. They had family back in England. So the idea of independency was really radical. And it was not popular early on. Related to that, I think if you could take a time machine, Paul, and go back and talk to some of them around the time that shots were fired in Lexington and Concord, mid-April 1775, a lot of them would have told you in private, this isn't going to work. We're going to be swinging from a British rope. Um, Benjamin Rush, who was the great surgeon, famous surgeon from Philadelphia, he even once remarked like a cruel, fatalistic office bet, like, who's going to win the Super Bowl kind of thing. It was who's going to be the first to swing from a rope. He said, in signing this, we're signing our death warrants. So in signing it and doing this, these guys were courageous. I mean, this is heretofore unseen in human history. It's a brand new gift to humanity, and it's a risky gift. A few of them had their houses burned by the British. They were on the run. They thought they were going to swing. So I think just the sheer audacity of this, how unprecedented it was, and how courageous they were during this 74, 75, 76, this 3-year gradual move from reconciliation to what they called independency.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I appreciate that. Thank you for that. I want to talk to you for just a moment about you as a historian, because certainly you've studied presidents, you've studied first ladies, you've studied war, political leadership, all of this wonderful, great American history. And I wonder, throughout all of that research, did the Declaration become more inspiring? Because you said you saw it in a new light just a moment ago, and I wonder, was it more inspiring or was it just more complicated?
Mm. Both, both.
Mhm,
I'm back to it being completely inspiring right now. I admit that
mhm.
although I love the founders, the Declaration was always, I put it on a pedestal. But I often thought, Jefferson owned slaves and he's writing that all men are created equal. Philadelphia was, without question, the most progressive city in the country at the time. They had a law that if you were enslaved and you were in the city a certain number of days, you were automatically freed. So what you find is a lot of Southern delegates, even George Washington, as much as I honor him, what they would do is they would shuttle their enslaved workers back and forth on a wagon so they wouldn't be in the city enough days to be freed. So although I honored the document, loved the founders, I always saw the hypocrisy of the document, um, and the shortcomings regarding women, regarding indentured servants, Native Americans, the enslaved, even recent Irish immigrants. You find all sorts of exclusion. They weren't enfranchised. But after this deep dive for the last 2 years, I'm back to completely thinking it's an enlightened, remarkable document.
I use the word myth for our first question, and certainly there's a lot of myth around the Declaration. I think one is surrounding Jefferson himself as being the solo man with a quill, almost touched by lightning. But in your work, you talk about how much the committee made alterations, the Committee of Five, and Congress itself. And so I wonder, through all of the edits that you talk about in the book, and the debates and the egos, the compromises, all of that political pressure, was was it really just this solitary genius
Mhm.
on the part of Jefferson, or did the committee fight
Yeah.
and produce this wonderful document? How much back and forth took place?
Again, both. Jefferson was struck by
Mhm.
lightning, basically. He spent 17 days in a second-story loft at the Graff house. Graff was a bricklayer. And, his first version was darn near his final version, so it was a stroke of genius. Now, having done that, part of Jefferson's genius was not necessarily originality. He borrowed from George Mason all the way back to the great Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, all the way back to Aristotle. So he knew what to read and he knew what to cut and paste and put into it. But you're absolutely right, Paul. Part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to say that Jefferson isn't solely responsible for this. Ben Franklin was a remarkable editor. He offered so much. John Adams offered input. And then on July 3rd, the entire Congress debated, removed, added. It seems like Franklin may have advocated taking out as much as 40% of Jefferson's work and adding maybe 20%. At one point, Jefferson complained that it was his genius was mangled. So, and Jefferson is, he's a rather soft and prissy and affected, kind of a whiny person, despite his brilliance and all that. And in a way, it's good that Jefferson was as, whiny as he was, because what he does is if Franklin added or took something out, or the Congress added or took something out, he would rewrite his version and then write what changes they made. So we know exactly what changes, where it was added, where it was taken away. And he would say, they took this out, they added that. He gave James Madison, who was a neighbor, a very close friend, kind of a disciple of his, he gives him a copy of it. So as as an historian, I just simply looked at Jefferson's original and looked at where he marked all the changes, and it's unmistakable to me that the changes are much better. The document is way better. And, Jefferson, despite saying it was mangled and whining and complaining, um, he lives a long life. He lives until 1826. It wasn't until at the very end of his life, he kind of says, okay, maybe Franklin's changes were good. And at one point, he was so, um, I don't know, bothered by this that he seems to be getting on the nerves of some of the others. So they asked Ben Franklin to talk to him. And Franklin says, I want to tell you a story of a guy named John Thompson, who's a hat maker. And he needs a sign for his hat business. So he contacts this sign maker and he says, I want a hat that says John Thompson, maker of fine hats, accepts barter, accepts cash, ready to order. This big long, and the sign maker basically says, that's not a sign, it's a paragraph. So the sign maker makes a sign that says Thompson with the image of a hat. And Jefferson says to Franklin, what's your point? Franklin says, less is more. In other words, it's a better document. So Ben Franklin greatly improved it. The entire committee greatly improved it. This does not take away from Jefferson's inspired genius, but it's a fallacy to think it was a lone guy for 17 days doing everything. It was a committee assignment.
Sometimes a little calming influence in the room is helpful. Maybe Franklin took that role.
How do you say no to Ben Franklin? How do you not laugh with everything Ben Franklin says? Now, the Committee of Five, it was Livingston, Sherman, Jefferson, co-chaired by Adams and Franklin. Livingston and Sherman pretty much do almost nothing. Jefferson writes the first draft. Franklin does a lot of the editing and heavy lifting, and Adams does some work. So it really was and in the entire Congress. So, Paul, the old joke, here my job. If you want to make sure a proposal never works, you assign it to a committee. In this case, the committee actually worked. The committee as a whole, yeah.
I want to talk to you for a moment about the famous line, all men are created equal, and that promise, particularly some of the people who might have been excluded from that phrase, from that promise. And I wonder, as you read the letters and the diaries and all of the research that you did, the newspaper articles, records from some of those classes, from women, enslaved people, indigenous communities, did you find in that research hope in that phrase, all men are created equal? Or was it anger? Or as you say, could it have been both? Could both be true at the same time?
Yeah, it's both, but I do find hope in it.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's on the surface, it's maddening to think that most Americans, most colonists, most Americans were not covered by this. In fact, even in the South, if you wanted to own property, you couldn't just be a white man. You had to have a certain amount of money. So, I guess it's twofold. On one hand, go back to 1776, they couldn't even imagine a situation where all people would be enfranchised and be a part of this. I think despite them being visionaries, they could have never imagined, such a campaign by a Hillary Clinton or a Kamala Harris or Barack Obama being president or Mitt Romney as a Mormon running. But on the other hand, some of them were quite enlightened. Ben Franklin, John Adams, for example, were abolitionists. They understood women's rights. They were not happy with the treatment of Native Americans. Later, you have John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. Some of these people are pretty ahead of their time in terms of rights. So all men, we could substitute and say humanity, humankind. It's everything. And it's not to sugarcoat it because it would take a bloody civil war. But the founding documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, it doesn't bring everybody in. The Constitution allows the 3/5 clause and, slavery to exist, but it provides a means for a more perfect union. It's a step. And as you know, you have to walk before you can run. You don't sit down and play guitar with Eric Clapton the first day. You start learning chords and strings, and then you work your way into it. So it was a necessary first step. It's not meant to be parsed as like a linguist would, or what was the meaning, but it was a necessary first step, and it was very enlightened for the time. Even though from our perspective today, it's maddening.
Stay with us, because this story is about to turn from famous words on parchment to real people with everything at stake. We've been talking with Smithsonian Associate Robert Watson, who will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. We've been talking today about the Declaration of Independence and his new book titled The Declaration of Independence, titled Declaration, The Story of American Independence. As most of us know, though, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, the edits, the arguments, the vote, the signatures, all of this changed in a very moving way throughout the course of the Declaration's preparation. But now comes the part that makes this story far more gripping, because while those men debated liberty in Philadelphia, women were pushing the cause from parlors, printing shops, and battle camps. Enslaved people were hearing the language of freedom and asking the most dangerous question in America: does that promise include me? Indigenous nations were weighing survival, alliance, land, and sovereignty. And ordinary citizens were hearing words that could bring either a new nation or a hangman's rope. So don't go anywhere. Coming up, Smithsonian Associate Professor Robert Watson takes us behind the familiar names and into the forgotten voices, hidden risks, and unfinished promises behind America's founding document. This is where the Declaration stops. It stops being history. It stops being something we memorize and becomes history we still have to answer. Our returning guest is Dr. Robert Watson, who has written the wonderful book, Declaration, The Story of American Independence. Smithsonian Associate Dr. Robert Watson will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. We'll have links so that our audience can find out more information about Dr. Watson's work, Declaration, The Story of American Independence, as well as his upcoming performance and series at Smithsonian Associates. We're talking about the American 250 story today with Dr. Watson. So good to talk to you. Of course, all your work, all your research, a distinguished professor of American history at Lynn University. Dr. Watson, congratulations on everything. I want to return to this subject of the one famous line, all men are created equal, and talk about the women who shaped some of the independence. Abigail Adams writes, remember the ladies. Phyllis Wheatley embodies the contradiction. Mary Catherine Goddard. Tell us a little bit about the women who might have been forgotten in some of this, and maybe give us one forgotten woman's name in all of this memory that can...
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's really the trifecta right there. That's the hat trick, Paul. So congratulations on your hat trick. I'm a big fan of all three. Mary Catherine Goddard is remarkable, and it's a shame that her narrative, her voice has been kind of erased from the American story. So when Independence Day is actually not July 4th, it's July 2nd. It was July 2 that they voted for independency. On July 3rd, they debated the Declaration. July 3rd, John Adams writes a letter to Abigail saying basically that generations of Americans to come will celebrate July 2nd as Independence Day. And then July 4th, they approved the Declaration. So ironically, we celebrate the document, not the act that it affirmed. So it's July 2. But they didn't all sign it on July 4th. That's something else we get wrong. Only Hancock, the president, and Thompson, the secretary. But starting August 2nd, they decided that they would sign it. Now, given that a lot of them thought were going to be swinging from a British rope, I mean, the British would hunt them down, and they're putting their names on it. This is an admission of treason, for goodness sake. After the July 4th approval, one concern was who's going to print it. Because if you print it, your printing presses are now a target, and you're a target. And interestingly, talking about diverse voices, it was an immigrant named John Dunlap who came forward and printed it. That's why the first copy of the Declaration, which you and I like to look at in the National Archives, is called the Dunlap Broadside. So starting August 2nd, a month later, they decided maybe we should sign this thing. And it took quite a while to track everyone down. It's really August 2nd to about mid-January of 77 before they find, we didn't have cell phones, and some guys were all fighting in the war. How do you even find them? And not everybody that voted on July 2 ultimately signed it. Most did, but not everybody. So once they finally get all the signatures, now they have to print it, another copy with all the signatures. And there was some hesitancy from printers to print this. And that's when Mary Catherine Goddard comes forward and says, I'll print it, risking her life, risking her business, risking her family. And not only did she print it, but at the bottom of the Declaration, she has typeset Baltimore in Maryland, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. In other words, British, here's where I am, come get me, which inspired people, that heroism, that boldness, that bravery. And I'm happy to say the British didn't get her. So remarkable. And I think that story is even better than Nicolas Cage in National Treasure, where there's supposed to be a secret on it. The real secret is a woman's name is on it. Phyllis Wheatley, I'm a big fan of hers. First published Black poet. You know who else liked her work? George Washington. She wrote a poem for him, His Excellency General Washington. Remarkable poem. Tragically, she dies young, but think about the hypocrisy, but the complexities of a Black woman writing in support of Washington and the founders and liberty. But she sees their movement for liberty as a necessary first step and this larger sense of liberty for all. And a great Phyllis Wheatley aside, which is my favorite story from the Boston Tea Party, is, when they're dressed like Indians, appropriating Indian culture, dumping tea off the Dartmouth and so on. On board the ship, not only crates of English tea, but Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. These guys throw the tea over, but they don't throw her poetry over. Now, we don't know why. We don't know why. I love to think that maybe some guy is like, hey, Bill, pass me the poems, pass me that other crate. No, dude, that's Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. Her verse, her stanza, she's this progressive Black woman poet. It's Phyllis Wheatley. And they're like, oh, okay, we'll save that. But we don't know the story, but we know they saved it. And of course, Abigail Adams is remarkable. Big fan. Love John Adams, even though he could be difficult. Considered himself to be the intellectual of the group, but despite his ego, and I do like John, but despite his ego, he considered Abigail to be his intellectual equal. So Abigail Adams was a remarkable woman. Remember the Ladies? Unfortunately, we didn't. But yeah, I think you hit the trifecta right there. The three of my favorites. But and I'm hopeful that with the great work of the Smithsonian, with your program, hopefully there's some little, drop in the pond here, the drop in the ocean of my book can help to, bring these diverse voices back to the narrative, to the story.
I want to talk to you about the British royalty at the time, in particular the King George, and I wonder if you'll tell us a little bit about the difference between the colonists and our fervent belief about independence, and then the British perhaps making some miscalculations, some missteps in kind of treating what was really going on here. Might they even have, walked it and been able to survive it and not ended up in a war that ended up separating us?
Yeah. That's a great question. So it's easy to say the Declaration and the Revolutionary War, it's a product of George Washington being a hell of a commander, period. End of conversation. And he was remarkable. I'm a Washington fan. I'm not a revisionist on Washington. I think if anybody else had led this, well, think of it this way. He led a ragtag band of poorly trained farmers, ill-equipped blacksmiths, and teenagers who had never been away from home against the world's greatest military and won. That's extraordinary. But it's not a period at the end. It should be a ... because there was so much more. If you think about the utter audacity and impossibility of what they're doing, we didn't have an army, we didn't have a general, we didn't have a capital, we didn't have a currency, we didn't have a flag, we didn't have a national anthem, we didn't have, and during the Revolution, Congress is on the run when the British march into Philadelphia. And yet we're going to do this and we're going to win. So it was an uphill battle, to be sure, but the British made even more mistakes than we made. King George III was literally mad. And I think if you flip a coin, you're going to go 50-50 on the decisions. This guy went like 0 for 20. Parliament the same way. George III surrounded himself with people who kind of reinforced his own worst instincts. You want to go back to Doris Kearns Goodwin's team of rivals and Lincoln, or George Washington put the most brilliant Americans in his cabinet. Harry Truman demanded that his cabinet disagree with him. This is not George III's approach. All of his shortcomings were just enhanced by the kind of fools that he surrounded himself with. So Parliament was kind of run by knee-jerk arch nationalists. So, for example, they made more mistakes than we did. At one point, we send them an olive branch petition. We're Englishmen. We're willing to pay some taxes, but could you reopen our port or court, or could you take your foot off the gas a little? We sent the olive branch petition. His response is basically, I didn't even read it. And now I'm going to hit you with more taxes. And by the way, there's 5 more warships laden with redcoats on its way to. So he just made it worse, to the point where the original taxes were not really the cause of the Declaration or Revolution. Uh, if you took a time machine back to the end of the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War in the 1760s, what you'd find that people were willing to pay taxes. It was how they put the taxes on and how they ground us into the dirt. With King George III, the original goal that the French and Indian War left the British treasury empty. We need to tax people to replenish the treasury. That's no longer the goal. Very quickly, the goal becomes, let's grind the Americans into the dirt. It was not about replenishing the treasury. So, he made every mistake in the book. General Gage, General Howe, General Cornwallis, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, and they all made every mistake in the book. So George Washington's gift was making less mistakes. George Washington made mistakes, but he's the kind of guy who never makes the same mistake twice. He learns from it, and he kept at it and kept at it and realized this is a war of attrition. So, he deserves credit. Yeah, the founders do, but by golly, George III deserves we should thank him for making so many mistakes, right?
What a moment.
Yeah.
So good to be talking to you, Dr. Watson. I really just have one kind of final question amongst these tied to our Smithsonian audience, because so many of us are kind of thinking about legacy, what we are going to be passing on, perhaps what we're going to be inheriting, and maybe even what remains unfinished in some of our own lives. So what promise in the Declaration do you believe America has come closest to fulfilling? And which promise is it that, is keeping you up at night, that we haven't quite done what we needed to?
It's the same one on both sides. All men are created equal. If you think about, the 13th Amendment ended slavery in 1865, equal protection and birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment. 15th Amendment gives Black men the right to vote in 1870, women in 1920. The 24th Amendment ending poll taxes, literacy tests, and all that nonsense. 64 Civil Rights Act. It's been a difficult, bloody journey. And a lot of people didn't make it, but it has been a journey. And through much of that history, maybe not now, but through much of that history, the Declaration and what America did was the shining beacon on the hill, the city on a hill. All around the world, the Declaration inspired their own declarations. So it's been, I guess you could say, one of the most cited, if you will, or so what we did. And we gave the world, which I mentioned earlier, the Declaration is not just for us, it's for the world. It's an aspirational gift. We might not get there, but we're showing a new vision for how government and governance could be. And that, I think, is the microphone drop. That's the profound. But that same one frustrates me, that it took till 64 and 65 for the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. And as we're having this conversation, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were just all but gutted and eliminated. And we're not there yet. And we still have a lack of civility. In the 200, part of it's natural. Democracy's messy. In 200 years, we're going to be fighting about the Second Amendment. In 200 years, somebody's going to say, are we going to reform the Electoral College? These age-old debates. But so it's both inspiring and frustrating. At the same time. Same thing, yeah. Great questions.
Thanks so
Love
much.
it.
Well, it is always such a joy for me to talk to you. I always enjoy it. You just have such a great style about you, wonderful sense of humor, but that intellect, and congratulations on all of this. Smithsonian Associate Dr. Robert Watson has been our guest. Check out our show notes today for more details about his wonderful, really, I can't say this enough, Declaration, the Story of American Independence, his latest book. He'll be at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Dr. Watson, I hope we'll have you back. I just get such a thrill in talking to you. But again, be well, and we'll look forward to seeing you coming up at Smithsonian Associates.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for what you do. It's very important. I'd come back anytime for your show. And to your audience, thank you for supporting the Smithsonian Associates and the Smithsonian Institution. Talk about a global treasure. None more so.
Well
thank
said,
you, Paul.
sir. Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, Dr. Watson.
You too.
What a remarkable conversation with Smithsonian Associate Professor Robert Watson, Distinguished Professor of American History at Lynn University and author of the new book, Declaration, the Story of American Independence. Today in our Smithsonian Associate series, we looked at the Declaration of Independence as a document filled with courage, conflict, contradiction, and hope. Smithsonian Associate Robert Watson reminded us that 1776 was not a clean story carved in marble. It was argued over, edited, printed, read aloud, feared, celebrated, and challenged by people whose names deserve to be remembered. As America approaches its 250th anniversary, and as we celebrate along with Smithsonian Associates, this conversation asks all of us to look again at those famous words, all men are created equal. Who heard them? Who was excluded? Who carried them forward? And what do they still ask of us today? You can find today's story along with our full archive of previous Smithsonian Associates episodes at notold-better.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at notoldbetter and on Instagram at notoldbetter. You'll see lots of great stuff there, behind the scenes look, and a glimpse into everything about the Not Old Better Show. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelsang. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being part of this community. Please be well, be safe. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast, also on video now. Please join me again next time for another Smithsonian Associates 250th anniversary episode.